Hi. When preparing to read a text, why is learning about context so important? Let's take An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley as an example. And let's imagine, for the sake of this activity, that it was first performed in 1912. How would that audience have responded to Arthur Berling's speech in which he, a successful, hard-headed businessman, declares that the Titanic is an ingenious development, that talk of war is silly, and that society will continue to progress rapidly in upcoming years? Well, as an audience, we might have imagined that Berling is a successful role model, someone to look up to, someone who the audience is positioned to learn from. However, let's look at when An Inspector Calls really was performed for the first time, 1945. How would the audience have responded differently, bearing in mind that the Titanic had sank, that we've had 2 world wars, and that actually society continues to struggle? Well, perhaps instead we can see that Priestley is creating a damning message about capitalism, critiquing bourgeois society and their treatment of the working class. Context is clearly very important. So, I'm Mr. Hodge, this is English Teaching in Action, and today I'm going to show you how to prepare a meaningful context lesson that will allow your students to really comprehend and understand text on a deeper level. Today's lesson is all about Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, and I'm going to consider the importance of context to this text. Because on the one hand, when we read Of Mice and Men for the first time, perhaps with no outer world knowledge, we might think this is a story purely about the beauty of friendship and loyalty, and also betrayal. However, when we have knowledge of 1930s society, the Depression era and the American dream, we can see in fact that John Steinbeck is critiquing American heritage and history and questioning whether the American dream ever can really come true for everybody. In my last video, I talked about the importance of hooks and engagements when pre-reading a text, and those same strategies are still important when teaching about context. For example, with this starter, I really wanted to bring the text to life for my students and to make it feel like it was a real world story. And so I created my own bindle. A bindle like the bindle that George and Lenny carry at the start of Mice and Men. And I imagined the sort of items I might have found in George's own bindle. For example, beans, cutlery, a mess tin, a bus ticket, a work permit. The sorts of objects that are relevant to the start of the story when we're reading. I then pose some questions to the students. Who do you think this belongs to? Why? What deductions can you make about who this person is? Do you know when this book is set from the clues I've given you? What do you think their personality would be like? These are all questions that work on different levels, and by combining different images together we can make deeper deductions. For example, if we look at the bus ticket and the work permit, we might deduce that this person has travelled a very long way, is relocating, and is starting a new job, maybe even a new beginning to their life. This becomes very engaging for our students because they're curious, they want to find out who this person is, and when reading they want to find out if their guesses were right. Whenever I plan a lesson on context, I always use exactly the same analogy to explain it, even if a group have heard it a million times before. Because what this does is it embeds the idea over and over, but furthermore it allows any students who haven't quite understood the concept previously to understand it this time. And the way I do that, once again, is through storytelling. I will always say, when I ever introduce context, the idea of what would happen if Harry Potter hadn't been written today, but had been written back in the 1400s. What difference would there have been? Well, we certainly know that Harry Potter wouldn't be alive now. He'd have been burnt at the stake, because society in those days believed that witches were real and were sent from hell to mislead society, and therefore they needed to be burned, killed and murdered. This would really alter the story of Harry Potter, and is very memorable for them. Equally, if Little Red Riding Hood hadn't been written earlier but had been written today, how would the story about Little Red Riding Hood being misled by a wolf have changed? Well, perhaps you'd have texted grandma asking about who the wolf was. Perhaps you'd have called the police on arrival. It completely alters the story from its original. Therefore, by repeating this idea over and over, students really grasp and can remember the story rather than the definition. And this is useful because if students later say in other lessons, "Oh sir, what was context?" I can say, "Yes, what is context? Why would Harry Potter be different if it had been written hundreds of years ago?" And the students then remember and can explain what context is. Now we're on to the main activity, and I'm using a discovery learning model in order to explore the context with the students. Now I know that discovery learning has been under a lot of fire in recent years in favour of direct instruction. And in fact, often I do use direct instruction models. But as with all educational philosophies, I believe that it's really important to take a bit of everything, see what works for you and when, because on this occasion, I do believe that discovery learning is valuable because it will build curiosity, it will allow students to think for themselves, and it will allow them to really connect with the text that they're going to be reading. And remember, that's what pre-reading is partly about, hooking students in. It's also now about giving them the knowledge they need, and we will give them that knowledge a little bit later. So, the main activity here is an exhibition of images. I have selected a wide range of images that relate to the text's context. However, one thing I do differently to some others is that I think really carefully about how I group my images. One of the key things when teaching context is to really break it down to the bare essentials. What do students need? Because we can provide a huge amount of contextual information, which will make them very knowledgeable historically, but if it's not really relevant to what you're trying to say about the text, then it isn't really that important in an English literature lesson. So I hone it down and I think about what's going to be needed, and then I group my images. The way I grouped my images for Of Mice and Men was to look at what was happening before the year the text is set, what is happening when the text is set, and what is happening specifically in George and Lenny's lives. By looking at these three levels, I get a much richer understanding of the context, but at the same time really whittled down to what I need to really understand about why Lenny and George's struggle is so important. So, I provide my students with grouped images around the room, and I ask them to answer some questions as they go on their travels. What are the images of? How do the images connect? What would life be like if you lived there? What emotions would you feel? What do you want to learn about these images? What do you already know, and what questions are you going to ask? What you'll hopefully notice here is that my questions gradually become more and more highly skilled, more challenging, so there's differentiation here. Also, it's important to notice that I've built on ideas of background knowledge, what do you already know, but I'm also trying to build curiosity. What do you want to ask me? What do you want to know? Obviously, that's quite an open question, and I'm going to tell them things they don't want to know as well, but as a starting point, it's to make them want to ask, to have a discussion, because discussion leads to good engagement. Let's look at one of the example groups of slides. Let's look at the first one, the before. We have an image of the Statue of Liberty. We have an image of some sort of 1920s party. We have an image of the Hollywood sign and of a billboard that says world's highest standard of living. What can we infer as we move around the room from this specific set of images? Well, straight away I might have some background knowledge about the Statue of Liberty and the idea that liberty represents freedom. And that might lead me to think that America is the land of the free. Some students might have that knowledge already. Not all of them, but it's a starting point. Some might even already know about the American dream, that idea that Americans believe that society is built in a way that anyone can make it if they work hard and put their mind to it. The image of the party might suggest that society is very frivolous, exuberant, that people have a lot of money. And in fact, we get that qualified by the second image of world's highest standard of living. It seems to suggest to us that American society was wealthy. It confirms by working together, by showing that connection. Furthermore, the idea of Hollywood and glamour and success that we also associate with the ideas of Hollywood and Hollywood filmmaking continue to build on this image of an era that was about exuberance, about wealth, about celebration of Americans' values. Also, as a side note, I've created one set of images that are my challenge quotations. They're images from famous writers and politicians about the era. These are more challenging because rather than visual-based, they're text-based, and they're of a higher level of difficulty, so students can really pick those apart and see what they learn. For a class who struggle with the sort of freedom of walking around a room, you could just provide the images on the board or on a piece of paper in front of them. And this would allow for a more easily managed classroom environment. To really build that Depression era feeling in my classroom, whilst they're walking around, I might have played them the record, "Brother, Can You Spare Me a Dime?" And that's going to be the next step of my learning. The students have begun to be curious, they've begun to question, they might have begun to make links. And I'm going to be walking around the classroom during this activity, talking to them and having discussions and asking guided questions, ready for feedback later when we can all share our ideas. I'm helping them along the way. I'm not allowing them to be fully independent. I'm pushing them in the direction that I want them to go in, whilst allowing them to ask the questions that they want to ask. However, the next step is going to be to begin to consolidate those ideas by looking at the lyrics of "Brother, Can You Spare Me a Dime?" and asking them to make links. What do we learn about the time period from the lyrics? And what connections can we make between the song and the lyrics in order to develop our understanding further? This is beginning to take us back in our literary English direction by using words instead of pictures. Now my students will have had lots of creative ideas about the context, but it's up to me to guide them in the right direction and get them to know exactly what they need to know. So I'm going to break down the feedback session between the 4 different parts so far. We're going to have a section of the lesson on before the time period, during, the time period of George and Lenny and their experience themselves, and the song lyrics. And we're going to discuss. We're going to think, pair, share, and get students to discuss their own ideas briefly, and then they're going to feed back with me leading the conversation as a class. And I'm going to tell them the answers building on what they say and through that discussion. So for example, someone might point out that there were people on a farm and it looks very dusty, at which point I might talk about the Dust Bowl and share my knowledge. The way that I'm going to make sure that students write this is through mind mapping, which is quick and easy and concise. This way I can now answer the questions the student have, praise them for the good ideas they've already had, and really challenge them to think more deeply using questioning skills. By the end of the lesson, the students have been curious, they've explored the context of Mice and Men, they've asked questions, they've made guesses and predictions about the text, and we've had some really rich discussion. If I had any spare time at the end of the lesson, I might do some sort of quick quiz, or get them to recap, or to do a brain dump and write down everything they've learnt from memory during the lesson. Equally, I probably want to follow up with a slightly more formal version of homework. On the one hand, I could set a research task, but I think homework often actually needs a little bit more structure than a classroom. So even just providing a link to another website, for example BBC Bitesize, I've provided them with a very clear text that will build on the discussions we've already had and help them retain that knowledge, as well as perhaps learn a little bit more. However, I now want to make sure that my follow-up lesson equally continues to build on this idea of context. I don't want to rush on too quickly. My idea for the follow-up lesson might be firstly to do some retrieval to see what students have remembered, to make sure that it's embedded, to reteach any misconceptions that weren't understood. And I like to follow it up with some creative writing. I like students to think about how they can use this information they've learned to put themselves in the perspective of the characters they're going to be reading about. So I had students write home to a family member to tell them about their experiences as if they were themselves working on the farm. And I got them to structure their writing by getting them to think about what their life was like before the economic crash, during the Depression, and what life was like now on the farm itself. By imagining the story themselves, students continue to predict and guess what's going to happen, but equally, it really embeds the ideas by getting them to use it themselves and really challenging them to use as much of the information as possible. It's also just a great excuse to practice some creative writing skills. And there you have it, a context lesson that is really engaging, memorable, effective, will have taught them a lot of rounded, deep knowledge, and following on will also have hopefully embedded that knowledge, really preparing for students to understand the text. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave me a like. You can find me on Twitter, here, and as an added bonus, below you can find the lesson slides so you can try the lesson itself, or you could equally adapt it and edit it for another text for another class and to try out some of those activities. I hope you enjoy. Thanks for watching.